They were not conquerors, not yet. Just two exhausted men moving through a river they did not control. They had no army, no territory, no authority, only information. And that made them dangerous. So they were stopped, held, contained, exactly where they were supposed to be, until someone made a decision that seemed reasonable. Release them. Let them go. And with that single act, a river was exposed, a map was completed, and a boundary that had held for generations began to dissolve. I tell stories history softened. Subscribe if this kind of truth matters.
Before the British could dominate the Niger, they had to enter it. And that was not easy, because the Niger Delta was not empty space. It was controlled, structured, guarded by powerful trading states like Brass, known today as Nembe. These were not passive communities. They were economic gatekeepers. They controlled access to inland trade, movement of goods, the flow of information. The river was not just geography, it was power. And the assumption was simple. As long as access was controlled, influence could be contained. The British did not yet have control here. They had interest, and interest is not the same thing.
The Landa brothers were not the first Europeans to explore the region, but they were among the first to do something more dangerous. They connected the system. They moved through the interior and came down the Niger. What they carried was not just survival. It was knowledge. Knowledge of roots, knowledge of connections, knowledge of possibility. And when they reached the Delta, they were no longer just travelers. They were assets or threats, depending on who was looking.
When the landers arrived in Brass territory, they were detained, not out of chaos, but out of control. This is important. They were not attacked randomly. They were held deliberately, because the local authority understood something clearly. Access to the interior must remain controlled. If the British understood the river, they would not need permission anymore, and that changes everything. At this point, the system was working exactly as intended. The outsiders were contained. The flow of power remained intact. Nothing had been lost, yet. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how power worked in the Delta. It was not centralized like an empire. It was negotiated, layered, built on trade, diplomacy, and strategic relationships. Leaders were not just rulers, they were brokers of access. And in that system, decisions were rarely emotional. They were calculated. Which brings us to the man at the center of this moment, a prince of Brass, King Boy Amain. Not an outsider to power, but someone operating within it.
The landers were detained. The system was holding. And then came the decision. They would be released, not executed, not permanently held, released, escorted, allowed to return. On the surface, it made sense. Avoid unnecessary conflict, maintain diplomatic posture, control the narrative. This was not surrender, it was strategy. But it was also a miscalculation, because the value of what the landers carried was underestimated.
The assumption was simple. Control the people, and you control the outcome. But the landers were not just people. They were carriers of information, and information does not stay contained.
Once released, they returned to British territory, and what they brought back changed the equation. They confirmed what had been uncertain, that the Niger flowed into the Atlantic, that it could be navigated, that access was possible. Not immediately, but eventually. And that was enough.
This is where the story shifts, not in the Delta, but in Britain. Because now the river was no longer a mystery. It was a pathway, a strategy, a future. Exploration turned into planning. Planning turned into presence. Presence turned into influence. What had once required negotiation would over time require less of it. The gate had not been broken, but it had been studied. And once something is understood, it can be redesigned.
Back in the Delta, nothing collapsed immediately. Trade continued. Authority remained. On the surface, the system was intact, but something had changed beneath it. The British now knew what lay beyond the gate, and over time they would return. Not as explorers, but as participants. Then competitors, then controllers. Historians debate the weight of this specific moment, but the structural shift it enabled is difficult to ignore. A decision made to maintain balance quietly altered it.
Today, this moment is rarely told as a turning point. It is often reduced to an act of assistance, a gesture of diplomacy, a small decision. But history is not shaped only by battles. It is shaped by access, by what is allowed to pass, by what is released instead of contained. King Boy Amain did not hand over power. He made a decision within the logic of his time. But power does not always reveal its consequences immediately. Sometimes it waits, it studies, and then it returns differently. Power is rarely lost in the moment it shifts. It is lost in the moment it is misunderstood. Power is never as permanent as it believes. More stories like this? Subscribe.